So I guess I can just begin. So I'm going to read something from my screen, so I won't know if there's anything happening on your screen. So my name is Shelley Tremain, and I'm an unemployed disabled philosopher of disability. That is, I have a PhD in philosophy from New York University, and my area of specialization in philosophy is disability. So I write about what disability is, how the category of disability came into being, philosophical analysis of the sources of disabled people's oppression, what social justice for disabled people and other marginalized groups requires, and so on. I've written books and articles on a range of topics, including ableism in philosophy and bioethics, disability in prenatal testing, disability in nursing homes, disability in language, and disability in stem cell research. I've also done some policy research around disability and human rights and community activism, including community radio programming. And I heard Jane Field perform her song Poster Kids No More. She actually wrote that for an multidisciplinary art exhibit that I coordinated for A-Space in Toronto in the mid-90s. So today I'm going to read you a paper that is an abbreviated version of an article that is forthcoming in a special issue of the International Journal of Critical Diversity Studies that I've guest edited. The theme of the issue is Philosophies of Disability and the Global Pandemic. Before I begin, I want to convey my deep appreciation and immense gratitude to Gabriel Peters, Catherine Frazee, the captioners, the ASL interpreters, Trudeau Lemons, Sarah Jama, Andre Demise, Spring Hawes, and everyone else who has organized and participated in this urgent and important event in the history of disabled people's struggles and activism in Canada. I think that this filibuster is a significant intervention into Canadian politics with respect to disability in general, and Bill C-7 and MAID in particular. I also think that if there's anything good that has come out of the current struggle against Bill C-7, it is that many of us have a renewed sense of solidarity and comradeship with other disabled Canadians, that we're finding each other, that we're showing up for each other. I think this is significant. It's meant a lot to me anyway. I also want to acknowledge that the land from which I'm joining this momentous event is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and directly adjacent to Haldimand Treaty territory. As a settler, I want to humbly offer my contribution to the Disability Filibuster with respect for the original peoples of Turtle Island and in the spirit of decolonization. So the paper that I'm going to read a condensed version of is entitled Philosophy of Disability, Conceptual Engineering, and the Nursing Home Industrial Complex. The first section of the paper is entitled Naturalization and Structural Gaslighting in Philosophy. Disability and its naturalized foundation impairment are typically represented in philosophical and popular discourses as naturally disadvantageous human characteristics, attributes, or properties that certain people embody or possess. That is generally regarded as self-evident, natural, and politically neutral phenomena that science and medicine can accurately represent. In recent years, however, an increasing number of disabled philosophers have challenged this individualized and medicalized understanding of disability, helping to consolidate a subfield of philosophy that I initiated and to which I gave the name Philosophy of Disability. For example, some of these philosophers of disability assume the tenets of the British social model of disability, arguing that although impairments are prediscursive and hence, that is before society, pre-social, and hence politically neutral human characteristics, disability is a pervasive form of social disadvantage imposed upon people with impairments. In my book, Foucault and Feminist Philosophy of Disability, and in numerous articles, I argue, contra the British social model, that both impairment and disability are socially constructed, invented rather than discovered, made rather than found. By drawing upon disabled French philosopher Michel Foucault's ideas, I have argued that disability is a historical construction all the way down. As a dispositif, to use Foucault's term, a complex apparatus of force relations that produces impairment as its naturally, that is, prediscursive disadvantageous foundation, to camouflage its own thoroughly contingent political motivation. An aim of my research is to indicate how this apparatus of power, that is the apparatus of disability, has been naturalized within the discipline of philosophy, especially to bring impairment into being as that kind of thing. Philosophers generally do not regard this sort of critical examination of disability and its production as philosophically defensible and pertinent to the research and teaching. Nor do they appreciate the critical importance of philosophy of disability, but rather remain resolute that philosophical inquiry about disability is appropriately and adequately conducted in the subfield of bioethics, a contestable subfield that both rationalizes and legitimizes eugenic practices. In Canada, for example, philosophers and bioethicists have played a fundamental role in the creation of a culture of eugenics within the discipline of philosophy itself and in Canadian society at large, both influencing the development and promulgation of some of the ableist legislation that I discuss in this presentation, and ensuring that specialists in philosophy of disability, especially disabled philosophers of disability, do not enter the ranks of professional philosophy in Canada. Indeed, more and more bioethicists in Canada and abroad dedicate considerable effort to the task of reconfiguring bioethics in ways that safeguard their own disciplinary, professional, and institutional jurisdiction over philosophical claims about disability. Thus, one dimension of my philosophical writing and activism in the profession is designed to show how disability and impairment are naturalized in philosophical and popular arguments, in what context these claims are mobilized and advanced, and for what social, economic, institutional, professional, and political purposes. In this presentation, I'll lay out some of my recent work on COVID-19 outbreaks in nursing homes, psychiatric hospitals, and other institutions in which disabled people and seniors are segregated, in order to identify an additional context in which we can recognize that the naturalized ontological status, which ontological just means what there is, what something is, So the naturalized, another context in which we can recognize that the naturalized ontological status attributed to disability and its conceptual objects is always already political. I will also argue that philosophers must engage in radical conceptual engineering that construes disability as an apparatus of power, a mechanism of which is the nursing home industrial complex, as I refer to it. One of my aims in this work is to show that the naturalization of an individualized and medicalized conception of disability in philosophical and other discourses about nursing homes and other institutions in which seniors, elders, and younger disabled people are put is a form of structural gaslighting. Feminist philosopher Nora Bernstein defines structural gaslighting as, and I quote, any conceptual work that functions to obscure the non-accidental connections between structures of oppression and the patterns of harm that they produce and license, end quote. My argument is that the epistemologies and ontologies of domination in philosophy that persistently naturalize disability repeatedly sabotage attempts to improve the situation and professional position of disabled philosophers, in part because these epistemologies and ontologies facilitate the reconstitution within both the discipline and profession of deeply entrenched prejudices according to which disabled people are defective, unreliable, and suboptimal, and thus not viable colleagues. Against the individualized and medicalized conception of disability that prevails in philosophy, I maintain that disability, as I indicated, I maintain that disability is an apparatus of power in Foucault's sense. The structural gaslighting about nursing homes, which the individualized and medicalized conception of disability bolsters and reproduces, is one strategy of this apparatus of disability. The exclusion of disabled people from the profession of philosophy and from other professions of epistemic authority is another strategy of this apparatus. As Foucault explained it, an apparatus is an ensemble of discourses, institutions, scientific statements, laws, administrative measures, and philosophical propositions mobilized in response to a perceived social need in a particular historical moment. My argument is that the perceived social requirement to which the historically and contextually specific apparatus of disability responds is biopolitical normalization. The next section is entitled Conceptual Engineering and the Nursing Home Industrial Complex. Philosophers have ignored the oppressive social, economic, and political features of and circumstances that surround nursing homes, assisted living centers, and other congregate settings in which seniors, elders, and younger disabled people are placed, preferring to understand and represent these settings as politically neutral sites of care, love, and benevolence, rather than understand and represent them as carceral environments that enabled the segregation and management of certain populations deemed to be unproductive and disposable. Not even philosophers who advance proposals about how society should respond to COVID-19 have interrogated the relationship between the outbreaks in these institutions and the insidious nature of the institutions themselves. This refusal on the part of philosophers to closely examine the social, economic, and political circumstances and contexts in which COVID-19 cases and deaths have occurred has enabled the ageist, ableist, classist, sexist, and racist conditions that precipitated these infections and fatalities in the institutions to remain obscured and unchallenged. By contrast, my recent philosophical work has called upon philosophers to pursue a form of conceptual re-engineering with respect to nursing homes. That is, to acknowledge that nursing homes, so-called long-term care facilities, supported living facilities, and other institutions in which seniors, elders, and younger disabled people are confined, constitute the fulcrum of a massive network of control that, as I've indicated, I call the nursing home industrial complex. This revision of our perceptions and understandings of nursing homes and their functions could be described as a process of semantic amelioration. Semantic amelioration, as feminist philosopher Sally Haslanger defines it, involves the expansion and improvement of the discursive resources available to us with which to understand phenomena. To illustrate this definition, Haslanger points to the movement from an understanding of the concept of race as a biological kind to an understanding of the concept of race as a socio-historical kind. Haslanger notes that the distinct conceptual schemas available in the respective historical milieus in which these disparate understandings of the metaphysical status of race have circulated constitute divergent understandings of the concept of race. With my own terms of reference, I want to argue that the conceptual schema that currently generates perceptions and understandings of nursing homes and other congregate settings in which seniors and disabled people are put is a historically contingent mechanism of the apparatus of disability. That is, the conceptual schema that construes these institutions as paradigmatic sites of care and love, rather than as the linchpin of an industrial complex of governmentality, is an artifact. That is, a historically contingent mechanism of the apparatus of disability and other apparatuses with which disability is entwined, such as the apparatus of class and the apparatus of race. On January 17th, 1961, during a televised farewell speech broadcast into the living rooms of a predominantly white middle-class America, President Dwight D. Eisenhower introduced the idea of an industrial complex by invoking the term military-industrial complex. Eisenhower's use of the term military-industrial complex was intended to warn this sector of the American public about, and I quote, the unprecedented conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry, end quote. Eisenhower coined the term military-industrial complex to articulate the concern that the more money that could potentially be made at home from military aggressions abroad, the more that military aggressions abroad would be made. And the more money at home and wars abroad that were made, the more influence that American manufacturers of military-related items would wield over elected US government officials in the states in which the items would be produced. So that's the definition of military-industrial complex. After Eisenhower, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and other members of the US-based prison abolition collective Critical Resistance coined the term prison industrial complex to refer to the system through which prisons have become a mechanism of racial segregation in the United States and a primary source of profits for many American manufacturers and multilateral corporations. Likewise, I use the term nursing home industrial complex to refer to an expansive neoliberal economic network that comprises nursing homes and other so-called care facilities, medical clothing and linen suppliers, healthcare and administrative temp agencies, professional associations and trade unions, housekeeping and laundry service contractors, prepared food companies, medical equipment manufacturers, pharmaceutical corporations, and other entities that benefit fiscally from the ageist and ableist segregation of senior and disabled populations in nursing homes and other institutions, with powerful nursing home lobbies informing the decision-making and actions of governments, universities, and even financial institutions themselves. Indeed, the boards of directors of nursing homes and other so-called care facilities are, for the most part, made up of the CEOs of financial institutions and their legal representatives, rather than disabled scholars and activists, as well as other community advocates for elder, seniors, and younger disabled people. In short, the nursing home industrial complex has increasingly come to hold the coercive economic influence over elected officials about which Eisenhower had forewarned. Note, for example, that the term nursing home industrial complex aptly describes the relationship between the American nursing home industry and US politicians, as was starkly evident when, in the summer of election year 2020, US Senator Mitch McConnell initiated legislation that would grant legal immunity to the owners of American nursing homes for liability related to COVID-19 deaths and any other fatalities that occur on their premises, something that's also been taken up by Doug Ford here in Ontario. As a mechanism of the apparatus of disability and ultimately neoliberalism, the nursing home industrial complex traverses across the borders of the United States, however, extending far beyond them, with the nursing home industry now an integral part of economies worldwide. The next section is entitled COVID-19 and the Nursing Home Industrial Complex in Canada. Since early March of 2020, discourses about COVID-19 cases and deaths in North American nursing homes and other institutions in which elders and disabled people are put have unraveled in the North American mainstream press and on social media. In the terms of these discourses, the COVID-19 cases and deaths in these institutions have been largely naturalized and medicalized, represented as an inevitable consequence of a vulnerability inherent to the residents of the institutions due to their age or an apparently intrinsic characteristic now commonly identified as an underlying condition, or in more technical terms, a comorbidity. Only sporadically has the succession of COVID-19 outbreaks in North American nursing homes been attributed to the very nature and functioning of the institutions themselves, including their carceral rationale, their architectural design, the scarcity of supplies and resources that beleaguers them, the isolation and disciplinary regimes that characterize them, their socially marginalized character, and the precarious, unskilled, and transient nature of the labor that sustains them. All of which elements constitute the individualizing and totalizing power and economic bottom line of the nursing home industrial complex. By late April of 2020, more than 1,000 of the 1,350 COVID-19 deaths that had by that time occurred in the Canadian province of Quebec were tied to nursing homes. In May 2020, the Progressive Conservative government of the province of Ontario issued a call to the Canadian Armed Forces to assist with the emergency in Ontario nursing homes, following the lead of the government of Quebec, which had already done so a month earlier. By June, that is only a month earlier, a month later, more than 80%, that is more than 6,000 of the total number of COVID-19 deaths in Canada by that time had occurred in nursing homes, with nursing homes in Quebec the hardest hit. From midsummer of 2020 on, Canada distinguished itself internationally as the country with the highest ratio of COVID-19 fatalities in nursing homes to total COVID-19 fatalities. By October 20th, 2020, there were COVID-19 outbreaks in 87 nursing homes in Ontario. By October 24th of 2020, almost a fifth of the COVID-19 deaths in Canada by that time had occurred in Ontario nursing homes, a figure that does not account for the COVID-19 deaths in other Ontario institutions in which elders and younger disabled people are incarcerated. Despite these ghastly figures, however, Ontario's neoliberal progressive conservative Premier Doug Ford has consistently refused to launch a comprehensive and transparent public inquiry into the circumstances surrounding these COVID-19 cases and deaths, forming instead an independent commission to which his government has continuously failed to provide adequate information. In addition, Ford has repeatedly ignored expert advice according to which COVID-19 testing of nursing home staff and provision to them of paid sick days and full-time hours with increased wages would reduce the spread of the virus by part-time staff who work in multiple locations to scrape together a livable wage and are compelled to do so even when sick. Instead, Ford and various members of his government have frequently admonished the people of Ontario to be better team players who should stay home, wear masks, practice social distancing, and wash their hands, effectively downloading to individual Ontarians full responsibility for the catastrophic transmission of the virus in nursing homes. This responsibilizing, to use Wendy Brown's term, of the people of Ontario has deflected attribution of culpability from both the Ford government's ongoing reluctance to prioritize people's lives over the economy and nursing home corporations, whose shareholders have accrued enormous profits throughout the pandemic that the Canadian federal government has supplemented with millions of dollars in pandemic relief. Indeed, for-profit nursing homes and so-called long-term care institutions in Ontario and other provincial jurisdictions are first and foremost lucrative real estate investments with substantial returns on these investments, which various levels of government in Canada both subsidize and protect. Most COVID-19 deaths in Ontario have indeed occurred in private for-profit nursing homes, resulting in public outcry and demands for the Canadian federal government of Justin Trudeau's Liberals to take control of long-term care, although funding and oversight of nursing homes in Canada fall under the jurisdiction of the provincial governments, not the federal government. This public outcry and these demands became more insistent, nevertheless, after military medical personnel deployed in more than a dozen Ontario nursing homes with outbreaks during the first wave of the pandemic roughly March to August of 2020, released a whistleblower report about health and safety violations in several of the facilities, almost all of which are for-profit nursing homes. The violations included cockroach and rodent infestations, verbal abuse of residents, dirty linen or no linen on residents' beds, inadequate cleaning and sanitizing of residents' rooms, fecal contamination, inedible food served to residents, force feeding residents to the point of audible choking, lack of personal protective equipment, lack of hygiene, understaffing, and lack of staff training with respect to infection control. The story that the military reports did not tell is that the abusive and neglective conditions of this report have been pervasive in these institutions for decades. During the second wave of the pandemic, family members of nursing home residents, geriatricians, and other advocates for seniors and elders have become politicized, organized, and more strident about the horrors of nursing homes that the pandemic has revealed. For example, they've launched a highly publicized protest in front of a Scarborough nursing home, circulated petitions, called for the Canadian federal government to develop national standards for these institutions, and so on. Nevertheless, the seeming necessity of nursing homes and their covertly carceral character have remained uncontested and uncritically accepted by this cohort of family members, friends, geriatricians, and other advocates of senior nursing home residents. Furthermore, the modest challenges to the nursing home industrial complex that these family members and advocates have advanced are concentrated more or less exclusively on the mistreatment of seniors and elders in for-profit nursing homes and other long-term care facilities, neglecting attention to or even acknowledgement of the younger disabled residents in these and other institutions, which is a divisive neglect compounded by the lack of political analysis of systemic ableism, disability, and ableist eugenics in the public statements, including their Twitter hashtag Senocide, that they've made to the mainstream press, on social media, and in other venues. Disabled scholars and activists have, however, repeatedly attempted to draw attention to the connections between the neoliberal agenda of the Ford government and other provincial governments, nursing homes, supported living facilities, and other institutions in which disabled people and elders are confined, and the history of ableist, racist, and eugenic government policies and practices in Canada, including the Canadian federal government's policies and practices of extermination and assimilation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Although the collection of COVID-19 related data for group homes and supported living centers, the congregate settings in which most institutionalized disabled people are segregated, has been sparse throughout the pandemic, manifesting the myriad ways that the federal and provincial governments of Canada have in general neglected disabled Canadians since the outset of the pandemic. The issues with respect to staffing and crowded living space quarters are similar across all of these institutional settings. By February 4th, 2021, 1,195 outbreaks had occurred in Ontario nursing homes since the outset of the pandemic. And in addition, 459 outbreaks had during this period occurred in Ontario group homes and the other Ontario institutions in which most institutionalized younger disabled people have been placed. Nora Laredo an independent journalist who has diligently collected data throughout the pandemic on the number of outbreaks and deaths in all residential settings across Canada, reported on February 6, 2021, that 14,867 of the 20,702 COVID-19 deaths in Canada by that time had occurred in 1,484 of these institutional settings. Laredo emphasizes the fraught nature of the data. In Canada, as Megan Linton and Alan Minkowitz point out, no disaggregated data has been released on the impacts of the pandemic on disabled people. Indeed, whether it be data collection, COVID-19 vaccines, financial support, or housing and food security, disabled Canadians, a sector of the Canadian population that is disproportionately dying from COVID-19, have been systematically and consistently left out of the Canadian government's policies and planning during the pandemic. As Laredo puts it, and I quote, "Of all the systemic issues that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, none has been more significant than ableism. Ableism," Laredo writes, "is," and I quote, "the thread that has run throughout every aspect of this pandemic," and explains why Canada's response to it has been negligently inadequate. For Laredo, the COVID-19 deaths in nursing homes and other institutions across Canada in which elders and younger disabled people are segregated is tantamount to mass murder. I call it neo-eugenics biopolitics. Even well-kept, adequately staffed, publicly owned and operated nursing homes and so-called care facilities cannot be the adequate response to the question of how societies should respond to elders and younger disabled people. On the contrary, such apparently genteel institutions should rather be recognized as the window dressing of the nursing home industrial complex, which is a carceral network of power that operates in the service of ableism, ageism, and racism, while underwriting a neoliberal socio-economic and political environment in which productivity and profit are steadily prioritized, and elders, seniors, and younger disabled people are devalued, disenfranchised, and deemed disposable. Indeed, government-owned and operated nursing homes are no more ideal alternatives to privately owned for-profit nursing homes than government-owned and operated prisons are ideal alternatives to privately owned for-profit prisons, the latter of which institutions also operate in the service of forms of power that disenfranchise and render disposable certain populations, especially racialized, Indigenous, disabled, poor, and trans populations. So the last section of this version of my paper is COVID-19 and vulnerabilized populations. Disabled philosopher of disability Joseph Stramondo has argued that residential institutions where disabled people live should be defined in terms of the power relations that structure them and circulate within them. Whether disabled people live in them with or without control, proxy control if necessary, a control of the types of support and care that they receive, whether they live in them with or without control of when support and care are provided, where they are provided and by where they are provided and by whom they are provided. Nursing homes and other so-called care facilities in which seniors, elders, and younger disabled people are put, insofar as they are total institutions, do not, however, enable such discretionary acts or even allow for the possibility of their execution. In a total institution, Irving Goffman noted, and I quote, "Minute segments of a person's line of activity may be subjected to regulations and judgments by staff," end quote. In his classic 1961 text, Asylums, Goffman wrote, and I quote, "A total institution may be defined as a place of residence and work where a large number of like-situated individuals cut off from the wider societies for an appreciable period of time together lead an enclosed, formally administered round of life. Prisons serve as a clear example, providing we appreciate that what is prison-like about prisons is found in institutions whose members have broken no laws," end quote. As total institutions, nursing homes and other congregate facilities in which elders and younger disabled people are segregated constitute significant mechanisms of government, where the term government should be understood in the sense that Foucault adopted, that is, should be understood to refer to any mode of action, more or less considered and calculated, that is bound to structure the field of possible actions of someone else. In nursing homes, Sarah Luderman remarks, and I quote, "Residents depend on and are at mercy of the staff. Nursing home residents do not choose with whom they live or what activities they can do on a given day. Feeding, washing, and otherwise seeing to the needs of elderly and disabled residents all at once is more efficient than addressing those needs on an individual basis. But this efficiency," Luderman asserts, "comes at the expense of human dignity," end quote. Nursing homes, with their scheduled bath days and bowel days, wake-up times and bedtimes, frugal meal planning and food rationing, locked wards, visitor restrictions, and other signposts of carceral logic, are formulated upon asymmetrical relations of power that require compliance and homogeneity to ensure that their senior and disabled resident populations are rendered manageable. Indeed, as Goffman pointed out, the handling of many human needs by the bureaucratic organization of whole blocks of people, whether or not this is a necessary or effective means of social organization in the circumstances, is the key fact of total institutions, which enables personnel whose primary activities are observation and surveillance to more efficiently supervise these people. To put the point another way, residents or inmates of nursing homes are deprived of freedom of non-domination, are the subjects of and subjected to the arbitrary power of nursing home staff and the machinery of the nursing home industrial complex. That is, seniors, elders, and younger disabled people put in nursing homes and other care institutions are subject to a form of power that can be exercised over them at any given time, on any given day, at the behest or whim of any staff member of the institutions. A form of power that implicitly depends upon a certain obedience and deference from these resident inmates or their proxy decision makers, as well as abrogation of privacy and self-determination from them. Complaints and reports of, for instance, rough or otherwise harsh treatment, of undesirable or inedible food, of unwashed clothing, of missing personal property, of breaches of privacy, or of sexual and physical abuse can and do result in reprisals from nursing home staff and administration. In short, insofar as nursing homes and other so-called long-term care facilities in which seniors and disabled people are confined require of them and their advocates a certain docility, these spheres of domination contribute to the production of the carceral archipelago of modern societies, though they're not widely recognized and acknowledged as doing so. Claims to the contrary, that is, claims according to which nursing homes and similar institutions are sites of care and love, constitute acts of structural gaslighting. Foucault introduced the term carceral archipelago to refer to the ways in which forms of power that condition the management and organization of the modern prison have come to characterize the management and organization of contemporary society more generally, that is, society outside of the prison. In the carceral archipelago, as Foucault envisioned it, institutions such as nursing homes and other entities and sites which are not usually associated with the prison, with the carceral, and with the punitive, are in fact islands of the carceral, whose architecture, routines, schedules, and purposes mirror the physical and conceptual design and functions of the prison. As Foucault sardonically asked, and I quote, "Is it surprising that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks, hospitals, which all resemble prisons?" End quote. Throughout this presentation, I've aimed to show that the COVID-19 pandemic has thrown into relief the ways that nursing homes and other long-term care facilities are like rather than unlike prisons. Jonathan Marchand, a disabled activist, captured this understanding of nursing homes and so-called care facilities when in his testimony to the Senate deliberations on Bill C-7, he stated, and I quote, "I'm appearing before you from what I consider my medical prison cell, a long-term care facility in Quebec. I oppose Bill C-7 because death with dignity doesn't exist without life with dignity." In his statement to the Senate committee, furthermore, Marchand repeatedly pointed out that disabled people are compelled to access MAID due to systemic ableist and racist discrimination against them, lack of community care and community supports, poverty, medical bias, and lack of accessible housing. That is due to systemic problems that ought to be addressed through political change and transformation, rather than incarceration and eugenics. In short, nursing homes, so-called long-term care facilities, and other institutions in which seniors, elders, and younger disabled people are confined, like prisons, must be abolished. That is, the nursing home industrial complex, like the prison industrial complex, must be dismantled. Replaced with adequately funded, culturally and ethnically appropriate home care, accessible housing, financial stability, and other government and community supports and services where people live. Many feminist philosophers and some disability theorists, rather than embark on a path of sustained critical examination of the concept of vulnerability, have worked to redeem the allegedly prediscursive status that is customarily ascribed to vulnerability and simultaneously disparaged. The apparent self-evidence of the natural status of vulnerability is, however, an artifact of structural gaslighting. Hence, the concept of vulnerability, too, should be the target of a feminist project of conceptual engineering. Rather than a prediscursive inherent human trait, Vulnerability is a contextually specific social phenomenon whose politically potent and artifactual character could be recognized and acknowledged if feminist philosophers, among others, were to take up Foucault's idea of eventualization. Foucault's term eventualization refers to a breach of self-evidence that exposes the singularity of a given practice or state of affairs. Eventualization, as a kind of conceptual engineering, aims to show that things are not as necessary as they seem. As Foucault remarked, and I quote, "It wasn't as a matter of course that mad people came to be regarded as mentally ill. It wasn't self-evident that the only thing to be done with the criminal was to lock him up. And it wasn't self-evident that the causes of illness were to be sought through the individual examination of bodies." End quote. One need not search for these sorts of historical exemplars of eventualization in the distant past. Consider, for example, the efforts to defund the police, which gained momentum throughout North America and across the globe in the summer of 2020, were acts of eventualization designed to undermine the allegedly self-evident necessity of these islands, namely police forces of the carceral archipelago. To take another example, consider the now decades-old movement to abolish prisons as a coordinated set of eventualization that refuses assumptions about the seeming necessity of the modern prison. As Ronaldo Walcott has pointed out, contemporary ideas about abolition are founded on the history and logic of the movement to end slavery in the Americas, the first abolition movement. Walcott thinks that when people understand that the contemporary abolition movement is built upon this history and logic, then they can appreciate that contemporary abolition is not limited to abolition of the prison industrial complex and police, but rather encompasses the abolition of property and the redistribution of the Earth's resources in a more equitable way. All goals that to many people have seemed too idealistic or even preposterous. Nevertheless, Walcott has described the philosophy of contemporary abolition thus, and I quote, "An abolitionist philosophy says that we need to redistribute resources so that everyone has adequate housing, so that everyone is housed. You need livable wages so that people who are working are not poor and precarious. It means everyone being able to have access to great, thorough health care. And we believe that when all those things are put in place, that people will live fundamentally different kinds of lives, and that we'll be building the foundation and more towards the abolition of police and the abolition of the prison culture that we have and beginning the process of moving towards seriously redressing and redistributing the Earth's wealth and bounty as opposed to what we have now." End quote. Activists and authors who implicitly engage in a form of conceptual engineering to advance these abolitionist endeavors argue that no one is illegal, but many people are illegalized. That no one is a criminal, but many people are criminalized. Likewise, I have argued that no one has a race or a disability, but people are racialized and disabled. No one is a vulnerable, to use the philosopher Eva Katay's term, but many people, including elders, disabled people, and prisoners, are made vulnerable, that is, are vulnerabilized. Contra Contra the implications of racist medicine, epidemiology, and popular discourse that have circulated throughout the pandemic, residents and staff of nursing homes located in predominantly Black and Brown neighborhoods of American cities are not disproportionately represented amongst COVID-19 cases and deaths because Black and Brown people are somehow innately vulnerable to contracting COVID-19 in ways that white people are not. No one is more naturally vulnerable of contracting COVID-19 than anyone else, nor is anyone, or because no one is, more naturally immune to contracting the virus than anyone else. Black, Brown, Indigenous, and disabled people, which are by no means mutually exclusive groups, are rather disproportionately vulnerabilized to COVID-19 by, among other things, the service sector jobs in which many of them are employed, by the crowded nursing homes, prisons, and other carceral institutions in which many of them are segregated, and by the proximate relations to personal assistants and other service providers that are routine features in the daily lives of many of them. The naturalization of vulnerability and risk in the context of discourse on COVID-19 is both individualizing and totalizing. The ableist and racist naturalization of vulnerability and risk in the context of COVID-19 is individualizing insofar as it attaches vulnerability and risk to the bodies of certain subjects, ensuring that they will be regulated and disciplined by virtue of this individualization, and in most cases will be enlisted to become self-regulating and self-disciplining. In addition, this naturalization of vulnerability and risk in the context of COVID-19 is totalizing insofar as it creates risk groups, statistical subpopulations whose respective naturalized gradations of susceptibility to the virus cover over the systemic, structural, and institutional mechanisms, such as the nursing home industrial complex and apparatuses, such as apparatuses of disability and race, that breed transmission of COVID-19 amongst marginalized people, fostering their vulnerability to it, and thus positioning them under increased scrutiny, surveillance, quarantine, and other forms of control. Seldom has this naturalization of vulnerability and susceptibility to COVID-19 led to increased social assistance, the expansion of paid sick leave, job, housing, and food security, or the other forms of economic and institutional change that would systematically and socially distance vulnerabilized people from the virus. A comment that African-American feminist legal scholar Dorothy Roberts recently made about the futility of care ethics for work on prisons and so-called child welfare systems also captures the futility of a care ethics approach, with its assumptions of disability, vulnerability, and risk, to nursing homes and other institutions in which seniors, elders, and younger disabled people are incarcerated. As Roberts put it, and I quote, "You can't fix prisons or so-called foster care by training their agents to be more caring. The very logic and design of these systems are antithetical to care," end quote. I want to argue likewise that the eugenic logic of neoliberalism, which provides the impetus for the nursing home industrial complex, makes a mockery of care and concern. To quote Roberts again, "The only way is abolition," end quote. In short, nursing homes and other institutions that confine seniors, elders, and younger disabled people must no longer be regarded as necessary and inevitable features of modern social existence to which there are no alternatives. Rather, we should regard upscaled regulation, renovation, and public ownership of nursing homes and other institutions in which seniors and younger disabled people are put as a kind of gentrification of apparatuses of power. Gentrification designed in large part to ease the minds of the community at large about the segregation and dehumanization that these institutions facilitate. In other words, gentrification that effectively expands the scope of apparatuses of power and the systemic injustices that they constitute and comprise. So I see I've run out of time, but I just want to make a few closing remarks about the presentation. So as I indicated at the outset of this session of Disability Filibuster, the paper I just read is a condensed version of an article that will be published in a special issue of a South African journal that I've guest edited. The published version of the paper that will appear in that journal will be dedicated to the memory of my disabled father, Robert Frederick Tremain, who died in a Chartwell-owned nursing home on December 9th, 2013. I just want to say that I think it's crucial for us to make the connections between Bill C7, carceral logics, and the history of eugenics in Canada. Not doing so reproduces structural gaslighting about how power circulates. We also need to continue to ask the questions that government officials, medical professionals, academics, and mainstream journalists continue to cover over. Last evening, Sarah Jama pointed out that some individual physicians need to be accountable for their abusive and negligent treatment of disabled people. I agree, and I think that this call for accountability also relates to nursing homes. In accounts about nursing homes in COVID-19 that are now commonplace in the mainstream press and on social media, etc., a number of male geriatricians now take up the role of experts on the subject of nursing homes. Why did it take this pandemic for these doctors to speak out about the abysmal conditions in these institutions? We need to ask this question. We need to demand that doctors be accountable for the predictable catastrophe that has taken place in these institutions, not just the government, but the medical profession, especially the doctors who have been taking salaries from nursing home corporations, enabling the nursing home industrial complex and allowing the dehumanizing conditions in nursing homes and other so-called long-term care facilities to persist and expand. So that's all I wanted to say. I'm sorry I went over my time.
Just unmuting. Hi, Shelley. It was amazing, though. Really, really amazing. I kept getting distracted from the thing I'm doing on the side because I couldn't stop listening to you. So I really, really appreciate it. That was incredible.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.